Chapter 2. Present Day. He saw Alicia's face, haloed by an intense white light. It was a face unchanged by time, though it had been more than 3 decades. All those years, little Alicia had become the one constant in his now lonely life. In that span, the 12-year-old girl had come to symbolize everything safe, sacred, and innocent in the world. A single pinhole of light in an otherwise black sky of human depravity, indecency, greed, lust, and violence. The image captured in that fading school photo was his prayer card, as meaningful to him as an icon of the Virgin Mary was to Catholics. What was this? At long last, Alicia was speaking to him. After 34 years of her mute smile, Alicia Franklin had chosen this moment to communicate with her lone remaining champion. "Open your eyes," Alicia whispered. "Detective Mulcahy, open your eyes." But his eyes were open. He was looking at Alicia. The bright light bathing her was nearly blinding. Then he felt gentle pressure on his shoulder, the slight rocking and shaking of someone gently rousing him awake. As his senses returned, the image of Alicia receded, her halo of light fading away. The voice grew louder and clearer. "How are you feeling this morning?" Mulcahy's eyes fluttered open. A different face hovered above his own, her blonde tresses dangling down toward his confused face like fragrant tendrils. "There you are," said the smiling young woman who was not Alicia Franklin. "Today's chemo, so you'll need to get ready. You okay to shower?" It all came back to him then. The gloom of his living room, now converted into his sick room, with the rental medical bed parked under a window. The pressure in his bladder, the sickening weight and fading warmth of the full colostomy bag attached to his lower abdomen. The dull, constant ache in his bones. And, of course, his diagnosis. Metastasized colon cancer. Stage 4. There is no Stage 5. Victoria Forrest, his visiting nurse, was reaching under the covers for the bag. Luckily, his reflexes were still sharp. He caught her hand. Gently, he grasped her wrist and moved it away from his foulness. "I told you, Vicky. I don't need you to do that," he said in his voice that sounded old and strange to him. During his vision, he possessed the strength and determination of a 28-year-old upstart detective, determined to do the right thing by a murdered girl. If only a fraction of that energy could translate to his waking world, he might yet make good on his promise. But in the light of day, Mulcahy felt weighed down by disease, loss, and time. So much time. "I'm not an invalid yet," Mulcahy protested. "It's not a problem, Detective," Vicky said. "I should be earning my keep." Mulcahy grasped the hospital bed controls, pushing a button to raise himself to a sitting position. He swiped off the sheets with the flair of a magician uncovering a trick and prepared to swing his legs out over the bed. Vicky lowered the bed rail. With any luck, he could push himself up without leaning on his young, pretty nurse. Mulcahy relished her company, but he couldn't abide that the girl giving him sponge baths, changing his colostomy bags, or even seeing the weakness slowly creeping into his chemo-ravaged, cancer-invaded 62-year-old body. No, sir. He'd shave, shower, and change his shit bag for as long as he was able. Thank you very much. And when he could no longer live by this code, well, there was always the service revolver tucked away in a drawer. He drew breath and then held it, like a power lifter preparing to hoist a great amount of weight. His bony arms and withered muscles trembled from the strain as he maneuvered his feet to the floor and pushed himself erect. He managed to rise. For one more day, he managed. Once he was up and moving, things became easier. His blood pressure evened out, and the haziness in his head cleared. His legs still worked pretty good, and his hand remained steady with a razor. He padded toward the bathroom. It helped that everything in his Monroeville rancher, where he'd lived for 40 years, was on one floor. "Give me 15 minutes to shit, shave, and shower," he called out, the pride of accomplishment energizing his voice. "Then we're off to the torture chamber." This was more like it, Mulcahy thought as each step lightened. This was the old Finbarr talking now. The detective who made a career of staring death in the eye would look his own right in the face. Only his would leave no mystery to solve, no whodunit to unravel. The evidence was as clear as those dark shadows dotting his liver and lungs in the x-rays. Cancer was the biggest, baddest serial killer of them all. And no detective had caught up to that motherfucker yet. Not even close. The murder of Alicia Franklin was another matter entirely. After all this time, Mulcahy was still thinking of her. Hell, he was still seeing her in his narcotic-numbed fever dreams, the frequency only increasing now that he had no other cases to occupy his mind. Despite an arrest and conviction 34 years ago, Mulcahy remained convinced that the real killer had not been caught. The fact that Alicia was showing up nearly every night at what would soon be his deathbed only confirmed this. What did he have? Another few weeks? A month? 6 weeks at the outside? None of the damn doctors would give him a straight answer. But he didn't need a specific day and date, did he? He could feel the flame flickering. Time was running out. But unfinished business remained. He knew this, too. So did Alicia. The detective had witnessed much wickedness over his decades working homicides in Pittsburgh. Some 200 murder cases. Everything from teenage mothers delivering their babies into porta-johns, the dead newborn dyed blue from the chemicals, to stone-cold whodunits tied to mob hits and random serial killers. Each one was a scar on Mulcahy's soul. Yet for each case he solved, an astonishing 83% of them, with the convictions to match, he believed there would be one less ghost standing at his deathbed. On the books, Alicia Franklin's case was cleared. A jury had rendered a verdict. The record showed a conviction. A subject was sentenced. But Mulcahy knew better. He always had. Yet it had taken his forced retirement, his cancer diagnosis, and the oceans of time he had on his hands since Molly passed to pull him back to his first case. It's where it all began for Detective Finbarr Mulcahy. His first murder. And now, it's where it would end. Even with 34 years come and gone, it remained as real as yesterday. All those clashes with Flores. The senior detective hell-bent on making lieutenant off of little Alicia's misfortune. If one suspect didn't fit, the Italian bull would shoehorn another into the collar. And Mulcahy? What did he do? Not enough, it turned out. Sure, he worked the case, applied his new methods, and followed the evidence. In the end, it wasn't good enough. Nowhere close. Unwittingly, his efforts only helped Flores. Mulcahy ended up providing the final piece in a railroad job that would send an innocent man to jail and lead to his senseless and brutal death behind bars. Evidence didn't lie. This Mulcahy knew. But it sure as hell could be bent and twisted until it was made to fit a predetermined outcome. The forced resolution to the Franklin case had been eating at him for more than 3 decades now. Who knows? Maybe all the knots in that case, tied in his guts, were what spawned the cancer. Perhaps this was his penance. Time served in an oncology ward. Mulcahy watched curiously as the clear plastic IV bag hanging from a hook dripped poison into his veins. It seemed so insidiously peaceful, this death of a dozen chemicals in a million mutant cells. An epic battle of life and death was raging inside his body. Yet all Mulcahy could do was observe the gentle, rhythmic, almost pleasant drips of those chemicals. He knew the clear cocktail was as uncaring and violent as any of the depraved killers he had helped capture over the years. Yet he welcomed it into his body because the cancer was even worse. Is that the way it worked? One wrong to match another, even blacker evil? He suspected that it was. His life's work was proof of this, wasn't it? What a world. What a life. What a way to go out. Not on his feet, with his blood up, but in a bed, with the ghosts of his unsolved cases keeping vigil. But Finbarr Mulcahy wasn't finished yet. There was still some time. He could still make things right for Alicia. He'd do it. Or he'd die trying. At this late date, he had nothing to lose. Back at the house, Mulcahy spread the yellow, dog-eared, coffee-stained files from Alicia Franklin's murder book on his dining room table. He'd sent Vicky home early, insisting he'd be just fine following the chemo. He bragged about developing a tolerance for the cocktail, just like he had for whiskey back in the day. In truth, Mulcahy wasn't much of a drinker, despite his thick Irish heritage. As an intellectual, he never understood men's desire to dilute their mental potency with alcohol. Besides, Molly never went in for it much. If his good and loyal wife could see him now, operating under the influence of cocktails far more potent than Bushmills. This was better, though. Better that Moll was gone. She didn't have to see Mulcahy's body suffer from every last molecule of the chemo and every last cell of the cancer. Despite his brave face for Vicky, Mulcahy was suffering. The little that remained of his gut was now in open revolt amid the chemo's assault. Alternating waves of nausea and cramps seized his abdomen. Fine pinpoints of sweat popped out on his forehead. He kept a plastic-lined garbage pail at his side, and he had no idea how long he could force himself to sit in the uncushioned oak chair at the dining table. But this was his method. Spread out the files and look at them from 10,000 feet. Find the connections between the victims and the people who came in and out of her lives. Each person's existence was an extended circle, radiating out from their bodies. And in every aspect of daily life, the circle intersected with hundreds of others. The homicide detective must probe each and every one of those overlapping areas where the circles intersect. And there, in one of those shaded areas, would be the detail that closes the case. It had been true for every last one of the 166 cases Mulcahy had made. And it would be true again for Alicia Franklin, his first case and his last. Mulcahy believed this with everything in him. All it required was some very long hours in an uncomfortable chair. Even this was part of Mulcahy's method. Never get too comfortable. It dims the focus. To stay sharp, choose a rigid, uncomfortable seat. This, and time, would do the trick. Seated in the uncomfortable chair at his dining table, the chemo still coursing through his system, Mulcahy had everything but the latter. Mulcahy lost all sense for how long he'd been working the evidence. He knew only that his ass was numb, and his legs were tingling with needle pricks by the time the familiar voice of Max Slovesko finally broke his concentration. "So what's Columbo up to today?" Slovesko called in his thick Pittsburgh accent as he entered the house and lumbered through its shadowed halls. Aside from his accent, the ex-cop's unnatural gait was another calling card. His footfalls struck discordant rhythms on the hardwood. "In here," Mulcahy called, his thin arms shaking as he labored to push himself up to his feet, his limbs still tingling with numbness. He felt no need to cover his work, his obsession. Slovesko was an ex-cop. He would understand. And when the time came, he would help. "Where's Vicky?" Slovesko asked as he rounded the corner, the usual hitch in his stride. Not a limp exactly, but an unnatural and awkward dip and swing of his left leg. "Sent her home so I could work," Mulcahy answered, both hands gripping the table to hold him up. He dipped his head to the file strewn across the polished honey-oak table. Slovesko scowled at the yellowed sheets and faded black-and-white photographs. "You're supposed to be retired," he scolded. "And you're supposed to be sick. Besides, you think I came over to see you?" Mulcahy cracked a grin. It was the truth, all of it. He could count on Slovesko for that. Neither had to pretend with the other. They both knew all about the weight of the job. But more importantly, they were united by the kinship of physical loss. Both were retired detectives from the Pittsburgh Police Department, but their exits couldn't have been more different. Mulcahy had been put to pasture upon reaching mandatory retirement age following a legendary career. With Molly gone nearly 3 years now, and the cancer growing inside him, Mulcahy had nothing left but the scheduled regimen of his chemo, the structure and discipline of his investigative approach, and the remnants of long, cold cases, the details of which floated like ashes from a dying fire in Mulcahy's mind. Slovesko was another matter entirely. At 42, he was still in his prime, but an IED blast outside of Baghdad took his left leg above the knee and left a shallow indentation the size and shape of a handheld magnifying glass near his left temple. One could still see the traces of ropey scar tissue that snaked across the top of his scalp, despite Slovesko's thick black hair. Physically, Slovesko could still do the job. It was the thick cobwebs and the stripped gears inside his mind, products of his traumatic brain injury, that marked the end to his detective work. Still, no subject was out of bounds among these two former colleagues. So Mulcahy liked to tease the muscular Slovesko that he always had more brawn than brains anyway. Slovesko always laughed, even on his darkest days. Before the detective's ill-fated deployment with his Pennsylvania National Guard unit, Slovesko had been Mulcahy's protégé, his closest disciple. While other young detectives found the senior sleuth to be remote, detached, and utterly impenetrable, Slovesko saw a willing mentor offering free, if not always easy, access to the reasoning that led him to solve some of the department's toughest homicides. In Slovesko, Mulcahy finally had a standard-bearer to carry forward the work and the ways he had started. The younger upstart was perhaps a blunter instrument than the agile-minded Irishman. But what Slovesko might have lacked in God-given IQ, he made up for with relentless, unquenchable curiosity. And truth be told, the younger detective's insatiable interest fanned Finbarr Mulcahy's sizable, if well-disguised, ego. He especially loved watching the mental gymnastics apparent on the big Ukrainian's face as Slovesko raced to follow the connections that would lead to another of Mulcahy's iron-clad collars. So when that homemade bomb exploded along some desolate, dusty road a half a world away, they both lost something, and they each mourned in their own way, but never, ever so that the other could see. Following his injury and his lengthy rehab, Slovetsko could be just fine 80% of the time. But then, out of the blue, the littlest thing could trip him up. The name of a song, a shortcut to the South Side, even what he had for dinner last night. And once he got stuck, frustration took over. Soon it became a complete breakdown. Slovetsko knew he was no longer any good on a case. No detective can compensate for a blind spot, not when you're working a murder. So he put in his papers, even though the department brass had given him a clear signal that he could have kept on collecting first-grade pay for sorting paper clips. Slovetsko would have none of it. The shield meant too much to him. He'd worked like hell to earn it. He'd worked like hell and more to live up to it. He would not betray its deep meaning for the sake of pity pay. And he sure as hell didn't want to be known in department lore as the dolt detective who rode a desk all day, never, ever working a case. So he walked, and he never looked back. Mulcahy admired his strength. By contrast, when he lost Molly, he barely could bring himself to acknowledge the fact. Sometimes he still didn't. The ultimate heads-down grinder trudged on as if nothing had changed. In the 3 years since Molly passed, a heart attack while tending her roses on a brilliant May morning, the ranch house remained unaltered, save for the medical bed now in the living room. And Mulcahy still found himself talking to her. His very soul needed the soothing familiarity of his years with her, even if her natural good cheer and the fragrance of the fresh-cut flowers from her garden had been replaced by gloom, dust, and moldering case files, something Molly would have never, ever allowed in her house. When Finbarr, Molly always addressed him by his full Irish name, was home, she insisted upon all of him. The department claimed him for some 70 hours a week, sometimes more. She wanted him the rest of the time. Life was too short not to be selfish about such things, and Mulcahy never resisted or resented this. It was their bargain, their truce, their promise, and commitment to each other, and the life they led. For her part, Molly never raised an angry word all those times he was called away, came home late, or was forced to scuttle vacation plans. It was understood that this was part of the job. A detective worked when there was crime, and crime didn't keep bankers' hours. Just the opposite. Finbarr and Molly would take and enjoy the in-betweens, and they'd leave everything else behind. It seemed like such a simple and small thing, but it was a gift. Molly was a gift. And in the years since she'd been gone, his love for her and his respect for her wisdom had only deepened. "You were right, Moll," he'd often say aloud to the empty house. "By God, good woman, you were right." Slovetsko, on the other hand, had let everything go to embrace his new life. Why create a pretense of holding on to the past when the here and now beckoned? When kids go from elementary school to college in the blink of an eye, when a wife, who'd taken on more than her fair share, was coming into her own in the professional world, when he could still do everything that was important. In the 18 months since severing ties with the department, Slovetsko had thrown himself full-time into his role as a family man. He was an ever-present, totally involved father to his twin sons, Zach and Zeb. He picked up many of the household duties from his wife, Lee, who was on her way up in the county administration. The only holdover in Slovetsko's life was Mulcahy. He was there for a sick friend. And if Mulcahy wanted to waste time chewing over old cases, Slovetsko would listen. But that was as far as it went. At least, that's what Slovetsko told himself. They played the retired cop's version of The Odd Couple, one with a new lease on life, trying to pull the other off the job. The one still bleeding blue, trying to tempt his counterpart with intriguing trapdoor questions like, What do you think about this?" Thus far, it had been a stalemate. Alicia Franklin would change everything.
"So, what does your blonde nursemaid think about your obsession with 34-year-old cases?"
Slavesco asked as he joined Mulcahy over the dining table, the 1960s-style hanging light offering the only illumination amid a bluish gloom.
"I have her on a need-to-know basis,"
Mulcahy scowled, flashing Slavesco an admonishing look from underneath his knitted brow.
"And don't talk about her like that. Hell, she's more useful than you. She's a whiz on that laptop computer of hers. I have her look up things. She probably thinks it humors me. You know, jogs my mind, gets it off the cancer, whatever. To her, it's therapy. She doesn't have to know I'm working a case."
"Is that what you call it?" Slavesco skeptically said.
"No thanks to you, I might add," Mulcahy frowned. "All you want to do is try and distract me with how great your life is since you gave up the murder business."
"One of us had to." Slavesco's tone was deadpan sour, but his curious eyes were scanning the scattered files, photographs, and witness statements arrayed on the dining room table. At the center was the wallet-sized school photo of Alicia Franklin. It was as if all the other material had been arranged to radiate out from that long-ago image.
"Still stuck on Olivia Newton-John,"
Slavesco muttered, his eyes locked on the files, on Alicia.
"Even if you find something, what good's it gonna do?"
Slavesco continued, reciting his familiar argument.
"She's gone. The sad-sack schmuck of a father is cold in his grave. The mother's a $2 drink lush and a $10 lay, last I heard. The poor bastard they put away got shanked in the joint 2 decades ago. Even your shit-heel partner, Fat Sal Flores, is 6 feet under. Though the prodigal son is captain now. God save us all. Go figure." "He wasn't my partner," Mulcahy coldly corrected.
"That's your comeback?" Slavesco turned, raising a thick, dark eyebrow. "You don't see a bigger problem here than me mislabeling Flores as your partner?"
"Like what?"
Mulcahy wouldn't look at his rival. He knew Slavesco was just testing him, just going through the motions and forcing Mulcahy to ask for his help. But the old detective was running out of time and energy. He needed to save every ounce for the case.
"Like, none of it matters to nobody," Slavesco answered, raising his voice. "It matters."
Mulcahy labored to match his volume, but his retort was weak and hoarse. "To you," Slavesco added, "so you can prove you were right, because your ego is 10 times bigger than you are, and if you can stick it to the old man, you can embarrass the son, settle the score with Flores, and finally prove the Mulcahy method was better. Only you're a relic. Captain Flores is the rock star, and the apple of the mayor's eye downtown."
"The case never sat right with me."
Mulcahy's voice was low and steady, almost plaintive in its search for closure. His sharp eyes looked beyond the old files and peered into the past, surveying all the mistakes he allowed to occur. Back then, he was far too inside his own head. The younger version of himself naively believed in the power of evidence to speak for itself. He mistakenly assumed the department had evolved from its bare-knuckle, knee-jerk practices of closing cases, just to put them down, as if a filing cabinet marked closed was the same thing as justice. Above all, Finbarr Mulcahy had let Sal Flores bully him, and he hated himself for it. Alicia Franklin deserved better. Slavesco shook his head. He wore a pathetic look on his face, as if staring at a helpless drunk or a degenerate gambler who just couldn't help himself. Worse, he would play the pathetic role of the enabler, the one procuring the booze or placing the bet.
All right, he said against his will. What do you got?
With that, Max Slavesco opened the door to the rabbit hole that he thought he'd closed forever when he left the department.
What precious piece of evidence has Mulcahy the Magnificent managed to unearth that everyone else, present company included, managed to miss these past 34 years?
Slavesco said with relish. Mulcahy's eyes